Neela, we don't hear you.
Hello, Professor Becker. We're just checking ourselves here, and we will start in a couple of minutes. Okay. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed our privilege to welcome you to this, the Inclusive Urban Design and COVID-19 Pandemic Plenary Session of the Inclusive Cities Symposium. My name is Neela Naidu, and I will be chairing the session along with Mr. Indumiso Zondo. Indumiso and I are planners in the Development Planning, Environment and Management Unit of the eThekwini Municipality in South Africa. We currently stand at an approximate known total of 190 million infections worldwide, and it is just coincidental that South Africa is in the middle of a devastating third wave that has resulted in a severe lockdown for 2 weeks as we try to curb the infection rate. So in the context of this worldwide pandemic, it would be interesting to listen to different perspectives on the challenges and how we adapt and interact in our environments. In our session today, we have 4 presenters. First, we have Mr. Nathan Iyer from Iyer Urban Design Studios in South Africa. Mr. Iyer will be presenting on designing the post-COVID city. Next, we have Professor Tafu Manda from the Mzuzu University in Malawi. Professor Manda will be presenting on the exclusion and adherence to COVID-19 prevention measures in Mzuzu City, Malawi. We will then have Professor Simon Becker from the Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Professor Becker will be presenting on African cities in the 2020s, their weaknesses and their strengths. And our 4th presenter is Professor Giambazu Serin from the University of Ion Mincu, Bucharest in Romania. Professor Serin will be presenting on the learnings from the COVID-19 crisis for a future urban planning logic, the bottom-up responses in Southeast Europe, Romania. Each presenter will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute comment, question and answer session. This is an interactive session, so please feel free to raise your comments and questions, and you are most welcome to also write them into the chat box. I will now hand you over to Indumiso, who will introduce our first presenter. Thank you.
Good morning, all, and good welcome to our hopefully be a very enlightening and very exciting session. Our first speaker, we have Mr. Nathan Iyer, who is the founder and creator of Nathan. Iyer. Our speaker has about 25 years of experience, and he has Sorry, hello.
Can you hear Indumiso? Hello, can you hear Indumiso?
It's breaking up Can you go on there?
Okay, it's breaking up.
Hello. Apologies, our network is a bit not good. Sorry, can you hear me?
I think they can't hear you. Nathan, can you hear Intermezzo?
It's very faint and the signal seems to drop from time to time. I wonder if perhaps you should maybe, if he can share with you, I don't know if that's possible.
Yes, by all means, Intermezzo.
Yours is quite clear.
Okay.
My apologies. It's this network that's giving us such issues. Okay, sorry, I was introducing Mr. Nathan Aya. As I was saying, that he has vast experience, over 25 years of experience, and has been working in very, very big projects in South Africa and also abroad, like your likes of Point Waterfront, Bridge City, Moses Mabhida, Konubia, which are big projects within Durban, and also recently led the spatial planner for a KZN Aerotropolis for Etia and the Durban Trade Port. Mr. Aya has also been part of the Planning and Development Commissioner for the province of KwaZulu-Natal, and is also a well-known and one of the leading and most influential urban designers nationally relating to this. In 2018, he has received a lot of awards, being won most of the outstanding planners at the SAPI Awards, and also received a President's Award from the Institute of Landscape Architects in 2011 for the efforts of the leading Moses Mabhida Stadium precinct in Durban. He has also lectured at master's level for planning, and also served as external examiner for urban design courses in architecture and at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. More recently, in 2020, Mr. Aya has presented two international conferences for post-COVID cities. Like today, he'll be also presenting to us. So he presented previously at ISOCAP, and has currently led urban design for two smart cities in Mauritius, which are currently under construction. A key aspect that Nathan brings is a strong leadership skills in design, with the ability to work across sectors and scales. Most importantly, Mr. Aya brings real implementation experience across several projects locally, internationally, while at the same time being able to engage at the conceptual and academic level. Mr. Nathan, it's such a privilege to introduce you, and I'll now give you your opportunity to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Ndemiso. Good morning, everyone. And I must say it's also a real privilege to be part of the symposium and to contribute towards it. So I was approached by eThekwini municipality, City of Durban, to make a contribution this morning. So I also like to acknowledge them and thank them for including me as part of this symposium. Now, Ndemiso has already mentioned that I've presented papers recently in the last year on post-COVID cities. And so what I've done is effectively, not much has changed during that time in terms of city development or planning. Of course, we've been stuck in this mode of COVID. And so I've leaned quite heavily on the previous work that I've done. So those of you who have been part of the previous presentations, you would recognize some of the material. However, I think if I can just start sharing my screen, I think the nuance to what this discussion is about this morning is really how do we build inclusive urban designs. And I think the operative word for me here, which I've underlined and in inverted commas, is designing. So The paper this morning is presented not necessarily on the basis of any sort of primary research or any theoretical kind of framework. It comes from a very real and practical approach to the word design, and almost in a way, my purpose this morning is to be provocative around how do we think about the future city, and hopefully stimulate some discussion and thought on what it is to design a more inclusive city in terms of a post-COVID city. So there are several parts to the presentation. I will put forward some principles which I think are important in guiding us in thinking about the post-COVID city. And lastly, I would conclude, and I guess here, this is where the provocation comes in, is where I would put forward a spatial model of what I'm suggesting a structure for a post-COVID city could be. And it's really just, again, putting it up in a way that provokes some discussion. I think what's important to acknowledge is that, whilst we're dealing with a major event, a public health crisis, it's important to recognize that, this is not something that stands in isolation. It is actually an event that we have to see in the context of a series of events that have been building up to a kind of global crisis. And these relate to a climate crisis and a climate change issue. Now, we've talked about, and that beyond this, there's likely to be further COVID incidents as we move forward into the future. And it's difficult to think of that when we're still grappling with how we overcome the current situation that we're in. But nevertheless, I think it's important to contextualize this as not a single event, but rather, and what's to come, what people predict that would come, is to see it as an event that relates to a much broader agenda around how do we actually change the course of development? How do we deal with climate change and rampant urbanization, and a particular form of urbanization? So I think, important to recognize that we're really at the intersection of a public health crisis with an urbanization crisis. And, it's interesting when you look at other events that have happened during the city and in our history, that, the reality is that every event around a public health crisis, whether it was the influenza in the early 1900s in Europe, always followed with interventions in the city to remedy that situation, whether it was looking at slums redevelopment, whether it was looking at bringing safe potable water into cities, that there always was an intervention which is around the infrastructure of the cities. And the infrastructure of cities is really about a concern for the public good. So we know that investment in the public good is about ensuring that cities grow, they prosper, and overcome the kind of tragedies that we face around public health crises and so on. So the key question is understanding this as part of a kind of solution that deals with the public realm and the public good of the city, and how do we build then a new sustainable city. The second part of this whole discussion around fixing the ills of the past has been the issue of has dense cities contributed to this? So is density a good thing or a bad thing in the situation? And if we think about the future city, how should we be thinking about density? And I would put forward that that density, or rather the impacts that we face as a result of density, is really around competition for space and a misaligned alignment of priorities, particularly around the public good. So you can't have density without public realm or public supportive framework. And I think furthermore, more, densities, if we were to look at an alternative to densities, I think that would be, far worse in terms of the broader objective. If we were to locate this post-COVID city within the idea of a larger debate around building future cities and more equitable cities. If we were to think about the opposite of density, it's probably far worse if we were to retreat back into low density kind of suburban, it's almost like a knee-jerk response to how do we create more space. In effect, it would do more what I'm suggesting. Because, we know throughout history that, cities remain the engine room of society. It's where things come together. History has shown us that, cities consistently remain the places where economic activity occurs, the epicenter of culture. It's places of social interaction. So if we talk about cities as a basis of bringing people together, cities by virtue of their density and complexity offer greater opportunities to be inclusive, as opposed to suburban or lower density environments. So, it's quite critical that when we talk about a post-COVID city, we still talk about the need for density, perhaps in a different way and with addition around how we think about the structure of that city. So the questions we should be asking ourselves is, how do we prioritize the needs of people within more compact and dense cities? How do we build cities around public space, around car-free zones, around, we've seen in other cities, the growth of promenades or high lines, which emphasize the needs of people over cars. How do we design cities on the basis of public transit that enables access and equity within the city? So, the next series of slides would be points that I would put forward as important in considering kind of principles or an approach towards building a more equitable and a post-COVID city. And I think first and foremost, is to recognize that the favelas of Latin America, the slums of India, and so on, effectively informal settlements and cities have been impacted the worst in terms of inequalities of our cities, and have really faced the hardest kind of battles against COVID-19. It's really just quite simple. It's the fact that the lack of infrastructure. How do you sanitize if there's no water, safe water brought into your environment? How do you social distance when there are no green spaces that allow you to social distance as part of the city? And we've seen this also in the developed world, that Black and brown communities are the most impacted on, have been the most impacted on in terms of COVID. And that relates to structural conditions of underdevelopment within even established cities. So, we can't talk about the post-COVID city if we don't tackle the wicked problem of cities that do not provide equity and enable support all its citizens. So I think that's the starting point if we talk about a post-COVID city. The second is to embrace biophilia and to understand that the post-COVID city is green. And I think what we've seen coming out of over the last year, whilst there was a need to social distance, at every opportunity, every window of opportunity to experience outdoor space, people would gravitate to outdoor space. So I think, it's a widely understood concept that, the human condition is improved by contact with nature. So if we talk about a post-COVID city, then we need to talk about the post-COVID city being physically green. And, that could mean integrating density with green spaces. So in a really tangible way, to date, when we talk about green architecture, we've spoken about energy efficiency and so on. But I think we need to place on the agenda access to usable green space as one of the parameters of green architecture or sustainable cities. And these are the factors that can be built into planning schemes and bylaws of cities. So if we think about the post-COVID city, we need to think about it in a very real and tangible way in terms of green spaces. The third aspect of a future post-COVID city and an equitable city is to understand that the essential infrastructure of public space, what exactly is it? Is it the essential infrastructure of roads for cars, or is the essential infrastructure around streets for people? So understanding that at every health crisis in the history, there's always been some infrastructure investment. So we need to ask ourselves and almost, in a way, use this opportunity to set in place a new understanding of what public infrastructure is and what are the fundamentals of a healthy city. And I think therein lies an opportunity that's come out of this situation. So how do we build at scale places for people that overcomes issues of the dominance of cars, and that we create space for relief within our cities. So how do we reimagine existing infrastructure? A case in point is the High Line, which is an abandoned railway line, which now is a linear park within the heart of New York City. So these are quite important aspects when we talk about the future of thinking about the essential infrastructure of cities. How do we use the new infrastructure in a way that moves people differently within the city? How do we prioritize cycling, walking within the city? So these are the kind of urgent conversations we need to have. The fourth sort of notion is this idea of the future of workplace within the post-COVID city. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, and people have, over the last year, worked from home. There's been lots of telecommuting, which is great because it's enabled a new way of doing business, and it also bridges the divide between space. So you're able to work across international borders, across the oceans and so on. So, it has definitely facilitated new ways of doing business, new ways of engaging. And so one questions, whether there is a need for future offices. And I would put forward that from a position that there will always be a need for offices. It's perhaps the way we think about collective spaces in offices and how offices actually function. So, can we create outdoor spaces or outdoor boardrooms, if you like, that allows for engagement? And why I say this is because, if ever there was a time where we needed to be creative and to find creative solutions for the problems that we're currently dealing with, is now. And we know that creativity is not a singular process, it's a collaborative process. And so the ability to come together and to innovate around being creative and finding solutions is absolutely vital in terms of the space we find ourselves in. So I think we should not discount the idea that the future city will continue to have offices and being an important part of the city. So if I were to distill this, the last few slides, into sort of key pointers toward a post-COVID city, I think first and foremost, it's really about, as a synopsis, to bring radical change to the public realm and the way we think about the public realm, to repurpose and reprioritize the makeup of streets. Are streets just for cars, or is it for people? Is it for cyclists? Is it social space? Is it gathering place? We need to pursue density because it's vital to civilization and to how we interact. But with the greening of our cities, we need to be inventive with our building codes. We need to innovate around the new office model. We need to move people differently. And lastly, and most importantly, is we need to bring equity in the city for all its citizens. So those would be the principles that I would extract. And if I were to then put it into a diagram, people talk about the 10-minute or the 15-minute city. And so I put forward this as a notion of what a post-COVID city could be. And I think it kind of speaks for itself as a diagram, but the basic principle is to structure development along transit spines that prioritize public transport, safe public transport, and that the structure of the city, as opposed to roads, are actually green corridors and promenades and spaces for people to interact, that there is a hierarchy of green spaces as part of the system, as collective spaces. And then there's a green frame around these dense areas, which could be productive space in terms of food security, but also in providing greater relief at scale in terms of green spaces. And then, 5-minute neighborhoods located within that. Density, towards the core of the city around the highest purpose public space and public transit. And so, these would be kind of ideas that I would have put forward as, towards a post-COVID city. So my concluding comments would be, that right now it is probably, given what we are experiencing throughout the world, and especially in the developing world, places like India, what we're experiencing in South Africa now, it's difficult to see something positive out of this. But I think, what we, in fact, apart from the misery we face now, we are at a potential turning point in the way we think about cities. And it's quite interesting that, whilst we deal and we come up with new ideas around cities, a lot of it is what we've spoken about previously. For the last 10 years, when we talked about sustainable cities, future cities, we've talked about them as green cities, as public transport cities, as people places. So in a kind of, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, in almost like a perverse way, COVID has opened up a window for us to really bring this agenda of a more sustainable green city to the fore, and to use the opportunity to garner political will, economic support to build this new vision of a city. And I think, it's really up to us as policymakers, as designers, to really collectively campaign for the building of a new form of city, and to retrofit current cities to meet these requirements or these principles. With that, I conclude. Thank you, Nila.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you. That's been quite an interesting and innovative approach. You've highlighted the public crisis, and importantly, that we need to embrace biophilia and to go green. And you gave us a possible new structure for how a city should include open space, and so it's been quite interesting and for all of us, eye-opening as well. We will now open the group to discussion. If you've got anything, please ask questions, or you're most welcome to write up your comments and questions in the chat and we will address them. So please feel free. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? You're most welcome. We want this to be an interactive session. Nathan, what's your view on cities that are already leading this green evolution, Singapore and that sort of thing? You showed us a picture there. How do you think we're doing? Do you see any changes that they should make? What's your view on all this? Thank you.
I think it's interesting that we're finding, really useful examples across the globe now of how spaces can adapt and how we can convert, existing infrastructure of the city. And I think obviously we've got to apply things in our own context. It has to fit and make sense here. And I guess, one of the local examples, if I look at the Durban context, is the Durban Promenade. I mean, what a wonderful space. And, you know, for those of you who are fortunate enough to visit Durban or live here, you will note that, you know, the promenade is a space that's used by everyone in Durban. And it's just this ability to create a dedicated public space at scale within the city that's fairly accessible from different parts of the city and through different forms, you know, whether it's private car, public walking, public transport. And so it's not, you know, inconceivable to think that we can make big impact in the developing world, you know, around usable public space. So whilst we often reference international examples, they're stunning local examples that we can also learn from. Yeah. I see a comment in the chat box. In the South African context, you know, how would you place densification or compact city concepts within the framework of urban inclusivity, considering the fact that low-income residential and informal settlement areas are mainly densified, yet at the same time not fully integrated into the spatial and economic fabric. So I think that's a really interesting question. So, you know, I think one has to recognize the potential or the current or existing social fabric of informal settlements and the kind of coping mechanisms that exist within a community like that. But I think where we fall short, and they probably achieve densities far superior than what a low-cost housing, subsidy housing equivalent would deliver. But I think where we fall short is that we do not provide the essential infrastructure to support those communities. And that means, you know, let's not romanticize about informal settlements. I think if you live in an informal settlement, you face hardship every day, you know. So, you know, it's not a romantic notion of that people build the houses themselves and so on. We need to catch up, and we need to provide essential infrastructure that's required to make that a healthy environment to live in. So I think it's yes, it is dense. It does provide for density, but I think the public good needs greater investment in these communities. I note that Sub's hand is up.
Thanks, Nathan. Subs, please go ahead.
Thanks, Neela. Morning, Nathan and co-chair and all participants. Yeah, I think Nathan kind of touched on it and the question, because I was actually going to ask the question, how do we look at the issue of public spaces and as a means, as bringing in inclusivity, as well as that we've now in that COVID context, and it's not going to change. How would we look at, you know, even we talk of in situ upgrading, but now with the notion of public space and respite spaces and collective spaces. But the same thing goes for like inner cities and RDP housing and even private sector housing. I mean, you just have to drive into Umhlanga at about 4 o'clock or 4:30, and there's an exodus of people coming out, workers, but there's really no pavement to walk on. Yeah. So, you know, those are some of the things that I think we just need to challenge in a context of regulators as well as professions, because I mean, a developer will always say, but you're taking this away from me, or you're making this my responsibility. But to what extent do we start insisting on certain things and making it part of sustainable development? It's amazing that we can, which is a good thing, we respond very proactively to environmental impact assessments. And I don't know where's our inclusivity or our pedestrian impact assessments, you know, or our public space impact assessments. I'm not calling for another layer of, you know, assessments, but I'm saying, where does that sit? And as planning, we sort of like just have shifted to what's the lot size and as traffic planners, what's the size of the road? And that's about it, and coverage and land use. And where does this sit if we're not going to engage with the other spaces? So I'm commenting, but I'm also asking the question. So there's the private sector as well as RDP. And I mean, what's the point of developing 5,000 units, even though the number is decreased, but not in an environment that's conducive to be resilient? And I think if we can start delving and piloting around what does that mean in those contexts will be important. And maybe, you know, in some ways we need to also celebrate what we have and start having, it's a bit like the Jane Jacobs thing. It's about taking our own neighborhoods, like you mentioned the case of the Promenade, but taking our own neighborhoods, be it in Berea, be it in Bluff, or wherever it is, Phoenix, Newlands, or KwaMashu, and start looking at existing spaces and how well they work, the ones that work well, and what's the designs behind that. So it's but comment and a bit of questions and a bit of suggestions. So sorry about that, Neela. It's not very direct. Thank you.
Yeah, but
That's
I think,
fine, Subs.
you know,
Nathan?
thanks for that, Subs. I think, you know, a lot of what you said is in support of what I was talking about. But I'd like to pick up on one point that you mentioned, because it's I see it as a nice opportunity. You know, we've created systems where for every project you have to have a TIA, a traffic impact assessment, and developers, because you secure your rights on the basis of ticking that box, you know, invest quite heavily in that. And it's given, I mean, this is the wicked situation we find ourselves in, is that it's actually given traffic engineers greater say in how our city should be built. So it's actually working against us in that, you know, for them to be approved, you've got to have 6 lanes of freeway or whatever the case is. And, you know, also related to that is, and I think it's quite necessary, is obviously the environmental impact. But again, the environmental impact is often considered in only in a specific way, looking at the ecology. And yes, I'm not debating that, that's important. But what about social environment? What about urban environment and so on? So, you know, I would advocate that in moving forward, that we need to look at our guidelines and bylaws and start introducing criteria for, if you're building a community, use your example of 5,000 people, then it has to have 1 hectare of open space, and it can't be leftover space. It has to be usable park space. All roads have to have a cycle lane. All primary routes have to have a cycle lane. Like the traffic engineers have said, every primary route has to have a bus route, you know, and so on. So I go back to where I concluded. I think we actually potentially at a turning point, and collectively we need to push for these changes. I think I'm using up too much of time. Thanks, Subs and Neela.
Thank you, Nathan. That's certainly a very interesting presentation. And you can see there's some like really asking questions that's coming out, certainly about social impact assessments and that sort of thing as part of the EIA. So we will move on, and we might have a discussion later. So we'll park some questions for then, or you can put it into the chat box and Nathan can respond. We will now move on to Professor Becker, because we are missing Professor Manda at this point. He might join us at a later stage. So Professor Becker, Indumiso will introduce you, and then you can carry on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Neela. And thank you to Nathan for a great presentation. Very, very enlightening and fresh. Now I'll move to Simon Becker. Simon Becker is an emeritus professor in sociology at the University of Stellenbosch, and he holds research appointments at Rhodes University and UKZN. He is also a research fellowship at the African Studies Center in Bordeaux, France, and at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Uppsala, and at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, and he is an editor of Repute. Prof, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can see. You can also see the presentation as well.
You can also see the presentation. Thank you very much, Chair. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to be with you. And let me start by saying over the last 10 years, I've learned more about African cities from my doctoral students than from my visits and my readings. So the map I'm going to be showing you, that map there, it shows the location of a number of their case studies, and these are pre-COVID case studies, which I will refer to. Let me start with a short impression of a summer school conference I attended at KwaZulu-Natal in Bamako in 2017. Its title was New Forms of Political Participation in Africa, and the researchers were young African scholars speaking to their recent doctoral studies. Most projects were urban-based and focused on movements involving young activists who organized by utilizing digital social media platforms. These movements targeted national rather than urban level political objectives. I left the conference with three enduring impressions. First, that digital media had significantly invaded urban political movements in urban Africa. Secondly, that little direct research addressed climate change, though service delivery was researched. And thirdly, though many did not succeed in their short-term political aims, this form of political participation and protest was here to stay. After the conference, moreover, I was left wondering whether the conclusion that Joran Thurborn and I had reached in 2012, that's 10 years ago, after a survey of capital cities in Africa, remained true. A conclusion underlining what I would like to call the absence of inclusivity in these capital cities in Africa. And this is what we wrote 10 years ago. African capital cities were powerless in the face of problems proposed by an avalanche of fleeing immigrants and of informally employed residents. It was now that Africa became the continent of slums, but the crisis and its effects were nevertheless managed by the state, the central state, not the city. African capitals and other big cities did not collapse into general misery. They polarized between the large impoverished majority and a political clique around the president and around business proteges of the president. So is that conclusion that we drew then still true? And I'm going to certainly not try and answer it generally, but I'd first like to turn to the issue of migration and of urbanization. Africa is today the least urbanized continent. At the same time, during the 20 years after 1995, the urban population of sub-Saharan Africa doubled and will exceed that is the urban population, will exceed that of Europe over the next decade. The process of urbanization, as we know, involves the mass transfer of population from rural to urban settings. This happens in two separate ways, either through the migration of people from rural to urban areas, or through the incorporation of rural areas into expanded urban areas, or of course of both. My first case study on migration toward a city aims to illustrate simply that this movement of people includes cross-border migration, not only internal migration, and that the collective identities of new urban migrants, that is, their shared meanings, shift and change once they reside in their new urban place. In a study some years ago of Francophone migrants in Cape Town, South Africa, Lekogo's research revealed that the migrants from Francophone countries in Africa, that is the Congos, Gabon, Senegal, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, as examples, found that their Francophone background, their French-speaking background, which was much less important to them at home than national and ethnic backgrounds, emerged as a significant shared identity in Cape Town. As a small minority, sharing this linguistic identity created for many a new important bond. The second case study of Yaoundé, the capital city of Cameroon, illustrates the rapidity of urbanization and urban growth over the first 50 post-independence years. As a capital city, moreover, the use by the national government and the presidency of national as well as global architecture, such as monuments, public places, street names, was designed to attract internal migrants from around the country to the city. Significantly, Togolo argues that members drawn from each of the two presidents' ethnic groups were not privileged as internal migrants during their tenures, which had happened in other East African countries. Rather, presidential exercise of power in the capital city led to the co-optation of elites throughout the country, enabling migratory networks to be continually forming around these elites. And this appears to have been the case, he argues, under both Ahidjo and Biya, the last two presidents of Cameroon. On a flight back to South Africa from Yaoundé in Cameroon, I asked my fellow passenger, seated next to me, he was a Cameroonian businessman practicing in South Africa, why the two homes of professors I had visited in Yaoundé were incomplete. Each had a ground floor and a first floor and a large number of metal rods sticking out of the unfinished second floor. He answered by explaining that the land on which much of inner Yaoundé was built is owned by the autochthone, the original residents of the area. The land accordingly was treated as customary leasehold, and the owner of the house leased the plot on which it is built from the traditional autochthone. In much of urban South Africa, he said, excluding the informal settlements, land is freehold tenure, and owning a plot gives the homeowner access to a bond, he said, where the plot is used as collateral. The bond, essentially a lease from the bank, is used to complete home construction. Owners in Yaoundé, he said, are not able to obtain equivalent bonds from banks and can continue construction solely when they have cash. Now, this anecdote, the story, raises the issue of land tenure in African cities, to which I now turn. The province of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its multiple municipal councils are responsible for the delivery of local government services to its residents. The quality and scope of these services for the majority of the urban population varies from poor in the former colonial city center of former Leopoldville, that is at the top, the Ancien Cité. It varies from poor there to poorer in the planned zone, that is in the center, the Cité Planifiée, and subsequently virtually non-existent in the more recent incorporated peripheral zone of the capital city and province. Accordingly, urban dwellers living in the capital city receive most urban services informally rather than from their municipalities. It is consequently no surprise that many residents consider the traditional institutions of chieftaincies within the boundaries of Kinshasa as genuine and worthy of support. These traditional institutions are continually adapting to this new urban environment. The process of adaptation, argues Ibaka, has not been uniform. Its form depends not only on the nature of chiefly authority, but also whether institutions find themselves in the former colonial zone in the north, in the new planned zone in the center, or in the peripheral zone of Kinshasa. In the former colonial zone, traditional institutions have disappeared and have been replaced by modern urban state institutions, the burgomestre and their municipal councils. In the planned zone, they have lost much of their authority, and in the periphery, they tend to coexist with their modern equivalents. With the creation of a national institution called the National Alliance of Traditional Authorities of Congo, some of the traditional leaders in the city have been offered a statutory opportunity to collaborate and to cohabit with their modern state institutions. Let me take you back to the map. Let us turn to Harare and its urban periphery. Today, Dombashawa is a dormitory village for Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe, as well as a peri-urban communal area hosting traditional settlements deemed rural in policy terms. In the context of rapid urbanization in Zimbabwe and less than adequate policies on rural development and on land tenure, land transactions in Domboshawa, just outside Harare and part of Harare, shifted from customary inheritance in the tribal line to individualized land transactions, such as direct land sales and renting. This privileged financially better off households. Household survival strategies also shifted from farm-based to off-farm and non-farm activities. Significantly, Hungwe, and that is Dr. Immaculate Ingwane, who is with us at the conference, Hungwe shows that the rapid urbanization in this peri-urban communal area of Zimbabwe was also due in large measure to the Zimbabwean government's two controversial land reform campaigns. The fast-track land reform program of 2001, which led to a chronic weakening of the country's agricultural infrastructure and an associated outmigration of farm workers. In the second place, Operation Muram Batsvina, and officially known as Operation Restore Order, which was a large-scale Zimbabwean government campaign forcibly to clear slum areas across the country. Launched in 2005, its impact on Harare's slum areas was to lead to high migration streams of Harare residents to Domboshawa. In addition, Hungwe argues that the diminishing influence of patriarchy in Domboshawa creates opportunities for women to buy land for themselves. This appears to be true for those women able to raise finance for themselves not for poorer women. Now, if the rapid urbanization recently of Yaoundé, which we saw earlier, is impressive, the case of Luanda, capital city of Angola, is extraordinary. In a phrase, the metropolitan population grew from some 1 million residents in 1985 to 8.5 million today. The authoritarian state has, through a vigorous urban redevelopment and housing policy, succeeded in what Krisa calls developmental patrimonialism. In fact, the personal and centralized rule of the president and presidency was mobilized for developmental purposes, since this was in the interest of those in power. As a consequence, with the availability of foreign financing for the petrostate and of foreign business allies, state-led housing development in Luanda has delivered on a scale to many in the middle class and the elite groups. In the case of the Zango housing project, despite the fact that its new residents have no legal tenure, houses have become valuable assets. This is not only illustrated by the prices that are paid for houses on the informal market, but also by their use as sources of investment or income generation. One could say that inclusivity has grown, particularly for the middle classes in Luanda. Let me pause from presenting case studies for a moment. It appears that the pessimistic prognosis Thurborn and I made some 10 years back is only partially factual. The majority do seem to remain largely trapped in informal housing with few individual tenure rights and with few immediate employment opportunities outside of the informal sector. This state of impoverishment, however, is not the same for all, as we saw in Luanda and in Kinshasa. The privileged minority, on the other hand, appear to have done better. The increasing role of digital and virtual platforms, the skilling and mobilization of young urban residents, the presence of globalizing influences in capital cities, policies aimed at smart cities, all may be viewed as strengths African cities will employ in the years ahead. While patrimonialism privileges the powerful, it may also promote certain types of urban development. So, what is there to be done about the key weakness of African cities? That is polarization and inequality in the city. And let me finish with a suggestion being made in South Africa for residents of South African cities. It is basically a proposed experiment to address the key weakness we have identified. And I quote from a CDE text. Let me read it to you. First, the argument is as follows for the experiment. South Africa is a country with millions of unskilled, inexperienced workers looking for work in a labor market that drives firms to minimize low-skilled employment and emphasize skill and capital-intensive activities. Few people in government or organized labor seem to believe that there is much prospect of expanding low-wage employment. Of those who think it is possible, most think that doing so would have to compromise the living standards of existing workers. So, the experiment: create an island on which to test whether more jobs could be created in low-wage, low-skilled sectors and would do so in a way that did not diminish the rights or incomes of any existing employee of any existing firm. The island could be an SEZ, a special economic zone, located close to a city, Gqeberha or Durban. Such a development project on an island would show or fail to show that such labor-intensive production, initially simply for export, with relaxed labor employment constraints and a minimum wage, could become an example from which the country and its cities could scale up its employment without major disruption to the modernizing sections of the national economy. Now, examples of goods that could be textiles, that goods could be produced in this way in the experiment, could be textiles or mass-produced industrial goods. Whether the South African Special Economic Zone tryout will work depends on a number of things. First of all, will the national government allow it? Second, will trade unions allow it? Thirdly, will large business interests allow it? And fourthly, will its success as a special economic zone be followed by transfer to South African cities as a whole, creating formal work for the low-skilled and the unemployed? Whatever the outcome, the key weakness of African cities, I believe, their deepening polarization and inequality, remains and requires intervention, as well as has been widely documented and stated by ourselves during this conference, during the COVID pandemic, because the COVID pandemic, as we know, exacerbates, deepens this divide. So my conclusion is that the emerging strengths many have identified of African cities in the future, such as the increasing role of digital and virtual platforms, the skilling and mobilization of young urban residents, the presence of globalizing influences in capital cities, policies aimed at creating smart and green cities, all will privilege the better off, or rather than the urban population as a whole. So let me repeat that. All these positives will privilege the better off in these cities rather than the urban population as a whole, unless the key weakness, polarization and inequality, is addressed at the same time. Thank you. And I have some references if anybody is interested in the paper that I've in fact sent to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Becker. That's been certainly quite interesting and eye-opening. And I quite enjoyed the challenge that you put out there about a new way of doing things and challenging business about upskilling. So yeah, that's quite enlightening. Thank you. We now open the room to discussion, to questions. And we have 5 minutes for this, so you're also free to write into the chat box. So here we go. It's open to everyone. Thank you. Professor Becker, you spoke a lot about, it's just a comment, you know, you touched on so many topics: geopolitical, women empowerment, upskilling, it's such a dynamic continent that we're on. So much happening. There's so much also possible creativity going forward. So it's going to be interesting to see how we evolve. You know, we have like 1/8 of the world's population and so much of potential in terms of our assets in terms of minerals and wealth. So it's going to be an interesting time to see how we develop going further. It was interesting hearing that we will soon have more urbanization than Europe, for example, you know. So it's quite a challenge, urbanization, migration, the largely poverty-stricken continent. So it's certainly an eye-opener and a lot of room for creativity. Just a comment from my side. Is there any other comments from anyone? Any discussions?
Yeah, and if I could just, if I may, just could add to what you've said. I mean, the issue, as we all know, coming from those of us from South Africa, there is the issue of, it's called xenophobia, but it really is a question of how do we both welcome people from elsewhere in Africa and offer what was promised in 1994 to those who had been excluded before. So there is the entitlement of 1994 as mitigated against thanking Africa and welcoming Africans coming in here. And it's a very difficult issue, and it is an issue that is found essentially in cities, because the large majority of those who are migrating from beyond our borders in Africa, in fact, emigrate to our cities. And that's, I mean, it's a real challenge that I think is important.
Thank you, Professor. I agree. It's like we've got to widen our spirit of Ubuntu to embrace everyone. And you spoke about a global world. So it's about global Ubuntu at this stage, I think. So thank you. I think that we will, there's no more comments.
Before you close the it's actually some comments on the chat box. Just quickly, Professor. Prof. Chipungu said, despite having taken the fast track land reform program and massive pre-urban housing development, Harare is still experiencing destruction of structures, illegal structures, failure to comply with town planning regulations, and to what extent is the government accommodated of the needs of the poor their hard-earned cash built houses.
Yes, I've just read that. I mean, let me try and say a few words about that. The first answer is that I don't know. I'm certainly I haven't kept up with what has been happening regarding the incorporation of land into urban areas within Zimbabwe. So I'm basing my knowledge largely on Dr. Ingwani, who's with us, Dr. from Venda, her work. It would seem to me that the issue of trying to obtain tenure, which is acceptable both to the cities as well as to those on land, is an important issue. And maybe if I could just make a comparison, I am aware if one goes to eThekwini, where the project has been organized, the metropolitan area of eThekwini incorporates a reasonably large area of what used to be the Bantustan, the homeland of KwaZulu, and in that area you have both ward councillors that have been elected by the eThekwini Metropolitan Council on the one hand, and you have at the same time in the same ward you have a chief. You have a chief who is recognized by many of the people living in his ward, and you have dual authority. And this is an issue, this is not common in metropolitan areas in South Africa, but it is certainly found also in many of the towns. So this is one of the issues that is a challenge, not only to the Zimbabwean government, but to elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Professor Becker. We have a colleague who has raised their hand. If they could please ask their question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mine is not a question per se, but mine is just a comment pertaining to what is happening in Zimbabwe. I've been following the presentation and the questions that have been raised in the chat box. Thank you very much, Prof. Becker, for that presentation. Now, my reflections are that the problem in Zimbabwe, specifically, I think it emanates from the operations of government that to some extent has become informal in nature. What do I mean is the government, they see or they witness these illegal developments taking place. They turn a blind eye to these illegal developments, mainly for political support. They need to garner political support, so they turn a blind eye. Whenever we are closer to elections, the government becomes informal in nature. They allow people to do illegal things, mainly because these people, they are the supporters of the ruling ZANU-PF, or they are the supporters of those that are vying for government posts. Then whenever we are done with elections, the government turns formal. They come back and start demolishing these illegal developments. So I think the problem is largely political in nature, because land has been used as a political tool, mainly to lure the poor people to support the political system that is currently prevailing in Zimbabwe. If you have been following the news, I think there was a press conference by the ZANU-PF political commissar some days before, saying we condemn all the demolitions of illegal structures in Zimbabwe. That is not how ZANU-PF works. We condemn that. They are engaging in that mode. Why? Because we are preparing for 2023 elections. So the government from now on will be informal in nature. It means all these illegal structures, all these illegal constructions, they will to some extent be permitted. And these are supporters of the ruling party. So from now on, the government is engaged in informal gear. Then once the ZANU-PF wins the election in 2023, you see around 2024, 2025, they'll come back and say, we need to clean up the cities. So I think the problem in Zimbabwe with regards to issues of inclusivity, with regards to issues of demolitions, is mainly a political problem that needs to be solved politically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Becker. If you could please respond to the questions raised and the comments raised in the chat. We will now move on to our next presenter, Professor Manda from Malawi. So on to you to do the introduction. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nila. Now our speaker is an associate professor. Manda is an urban planner in Malawi. He holds a PhD at UCT, an MS Master in Psychology from the University College of London. His research interests are urban informality, disaster risk management, land tenure, and global South-urbanism. He is an associate professor of planning at Mzuzu University of Malawi. And he also works as a consultant on several projects, including leading preparation of Malawi national urban policy and housing policy. He's also a director at an Urban Research and Advocacy Center, which is a research group that promotes research-based advocacy and people-centered urban development in Malawi. Over to you, Prof. Manda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. Prof, can go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to make a presentation on
Professor Manda, we cannot hear you.
Oh, you cannot hear me?
Yes, we can.
But the others cannot.
Yes, they just need to check their devices, but we can hear you clearly, Prof.
Thank you very much.
We can hear you.
Right. Me and my colleague
Professor Manda?
Hello? Yes, I think the host cannot hear me.
Kurt, won't you check on the volume? We cannot hear Professor Manda.
Everybody can. It's on your device there, Nina.
We can hear him, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. But you can assist her because she's the host.
Okay.
So I was saying that this presentation is done by myself and my colleague Somwale. And I present to you this outline. I talk about the background to the situation of COVID in Malawi and Mzuzu, the methodology, the results, a discussion and then conclusion and the recommendation. I must mention before I continue that what I present here are preliminary results from the study that we conducted in Mzuzu. We just finished entering the data. So it's not very conclusive, but I think it is worth sharing to your colleagues. Malawi is now in its third wave of COVID after initial detection of the pandemic in April 2020. I hope you are able all now to listen. Hello?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. You can see on my slide there, we are now registering until yesterday nearly 36,000 cases and 1,807 deaths. And that number includes 2 cabinet ministers who died early this year. So that is a significant increase of the COVID cases from 3,640 in July last year and 99 deaths that were reported. You may wish also to learn that only less than 400,000 have been vaccinated with the first jab and less than 100 of the second jab. Now, in that situation, we need now maybe to focus on preventive measures that can reduce transmission. And what the government has done as their key measures to limit the transmission has been threefold. Firstly, it has been policy legal. They have implemented laws, bylaws through travel restrictions, public gathering, and sometimes arresting of deviants, especially around the markets. There's been a lot of advocacy about physical distancing, some call it social, frequent hand washing with soap, sanitization, and wearing of masks. But they have gone further to distribute some cash handouts to what are considered the vulnerable in the cities. So to focus on why and what was our aim of conducting this study, you will know or remember that until last year, there was this perception that Africa was somehow immune to COVID. And we note now that several studies suggest that that is shifting. For example, in 2020, Malawians were reported to largely fear hunger than COVID. But recently, it is now shown that that perception is shifting to acceptance. We also see that despite the interventions by government, community adherence to prevention measures remains a big challenge, as is evident from the increasing cases and as well as the deaths. So it would be prudent, therefore, to focus on the issues that would help the community to adhere. But we also know that this adherence is dependent on the community's knowledge as well as their perceptions. So we undertook this study in the informal settlement of Mzuzu to find out the level of knowledge and perceptions as well as the adherence to these prevention measures. Mzuzu city is a small city compared to other cities that you all know. It's just 221,000 people, but it's growing very fast at 5.4%. Most of the inhabitants are in informal settlements. So we did a cross-sectional study targeting those that are 18 years and above in 3 informal settlements that are very close to the city center, but also to the industrial area. These are Salisbury Line, Ruinga, and Zorozoro. We had a sample of 625 inhabitants, and we used logistic regression to analyze the data. Our study was also approved here at the university, so we are within the ethics of this research. So what did we find? We found that 20.8% were not employed, 61% claimed to have businesses, and largely these are informal businesses. 7% were urban farmers, and 11% had no occupation at all. And then you see there that 55% earned less than $45 per month, and only 6.4% earned above 100,000, which is now the basic minimum wage for Marawi. So that's $129. Information exposure, we saw that nearly everybody had heard of COVID-19, and they had heard about it from different media, from state officials, from their friends through social networking, and also from health workers. The actual information they got was about prevention, symptoms, transmission, the number of cases, the interventions that have been done, and the complications. But we noticed that up to close to 36% did not have correct knowledge of how COVID is transmitted. Then we looked at knowledge and the perceptions of these inhabitants. We found that nearly everyone knew of COVID at least, and they knew the symptoms such as the body weaknesses, high fever, failure to breathe properly, loss of smell as they were putting it, sore throats, cough, and headache. 98.7% also knew prevention measures, and they were listing things like washing hands with soap, wearing of face masks, social distancing, not touching your eyes or mouth or nose, to self-isolate, to avoid crowded places, and staying at home. However, we saw that only 37.6 practiced correct measures themselves, even though they had the majority of them had a positive perception towards prevention measures. So what are the factors then for adherence? We saw that, as you will see in the table, we saw that the education was an important factor that was showing up to more than 1.4 times likelihood of adherence. Some income levels was also important. Information exposure was actually very, very important. It shows they are close to 7 times more likely to comply. And then the correct knowledge of COVID transmission was also important. But to a lesser extent, we see also good attitude was another factor. In that table, it shows all the variables that we are looking at, showing that the issues of age was important, level of education, the occupation, the income, information exposure. All these factors were relevant to determine the level of adherence to COVID prevention measures. So what did we come up with from our own perspective of analyzing these things? We see that the government interventions are largely failing. For example, they distribute a cash handout of 35,000, but the criteria for selection remains very unclear even to the beneficiaries themselves. When we asked them if they had known that they would be receiving this money, nearly all of them don't know. So the suspicion is that perhaps only those politically connected were being targeted, because this process of registration was happening when we were about to go for the rerun of the presidential elections. There was an intervention to buy one mask for each citizen, but the program has actually collapsed because nearly all the money meant for this project disappeared. There was an allocation of 6 billion Malay Kwacha and later 17 billion has not been accounted for. A report of the inquiry that was instituted has not been released to the public. It's now more than 3 months since it was delivered to the president. The second issue is the vaccination campaign has also been affected by poor perception on efficacy. As a result of that, 19,000 vaccines had expired and were publicly destroyed. And yet, as I speak now, there's a serious shortage for the vaccine. Many people have not been vaccinated and they were left stranded on the queues. And thirdly, advocacy on distancing and crowding has been compromised by political leaders themselves because of their campaigns for political office soon after the pandemic surge in June 2020. And this is continuing now, giving the impression that the wrong message is being sent to the general public while the policymakers are doing otherwise. If we look at the measures that we are mostly adhered to, you will see that most of them are very low compared to the rest of the world where these have been researched. So you see here that 32% were able to wear their face masks, but you see that is much lower than in other countries. Then washing of hands, we have only 27%, but elsewhere it's much, much higher in other countries. Perhaps if I can compare with Ethiopia, you'll find that the percentage is quite high to forget countries like USA. Then the fourth bullet there says 13% of the respondents at least managed to keep a safe distance when in public spaces. And that you see it's much, much lower than elsewhere in Ethiopia as well as Brazil. So our conclusion is that even though knowledge is very high, the practice to adhere to the measures is very low. And it shows here that these inhabitants have greater risk to COVID-19, largely because of their low incomes, their low education, inadequate space to observe distance in their homes and the community, lack of roads are impeding speedy evacuation. The interventions for support are one-off, and they are tending to be marred by corruption and unclear selection of beneficiaries. And finally, we are saying informal settlements are spatially excluded, which predisposes them to COVID-19 as they are unable to adhere to prescribed prevention measures. So we are recommending that perhaps a multi-sectoral approach that will increase awareness of COVID, its transmission and prevention measures could be blended with the inclusive social protection measures that would target all the vulnerable. We also suggest that we should focus on inclusion of informal settlements in city planning, not just in the planning process, but in the plan itself, so that they are connected to infrastructure and services, and that might help when they want to access health services. And finally, we are suggesting the improvement of housing conditions in these settlements. With that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manda. That's certainly interesting and another eye-opening example of what's going on in another country in the world. So, Professor Manda, you spoke about education and income, better knowledge, attitude. If that was more, if it was better or higher, that people would be more likely to respond, and that's interesting. It speaks of, I think, perhaps all of Africa needing more more development and more infrastructure, more public health knowledge. So it might sound like Malawi, but it might actually be more applicable more broadly. And I think certainly we can even link that to what's happening locally in South Africa. And it's also about income levels and things, and being able to afford the provision of hand sanitizers, although we are told that washing hands would also do the trick. So it's just interesting, I think, the commonality that we see all over the place. We now open the chat up, the room up to any comments or questions that Professor Manda can address. Thank you.
So perhaps as someone is preparing to question, I talked about the income levels as low as 35,000 Malawi kwacha. Maybe it might make more sense if I mention that one box of face masks is actually 15,000. So that means someone's whole 50% of his salary can just go to a box of masks.
Professor Manda, thank you for that. Dr. Chipungu has asked about the measures that are being taken by government to improve the living conditions within the informal settlements. Are there any improvements? You know, have they put in extra infrastructure, extra water standpipes, for example? So if you could just sort of provide us with some light on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are efforts, not largely from government, but from various actors, including the NGOs and the international organizations, to provide these services, such as public toilets are being constructed now. The others are putting up boreholes in these communities. In some cases, it's going as far as building new classrooms for primary schools so that they can decongest the classrooms. I know several NGOs are now providing water at the primary schools so that they can enhance the washing of hands. What I doubt is the sustainability of these measures. For example, provision of soap. When the pandemic just came, there was a lot of distribution of sanitizers and soap. But if you go around, the water is there, but there's no sanitization, there's no soap at all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Manda. That is a bit of a pity, but it's great to see that the NGOs and the international community is coming in to assist. And I think, you know, we can learn from this and better prepare how we go forward. It's a bit, you know, it is a pity hearing that there's water there, but not soap. And yet medically it's advocated that if we wash our hands properly, we don't actually need sanitizers. So that is the greatest pity. Are there any other questions from the room or comments that we can add? Subs, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the Professor. I'm just checking just a couple questions, comments. In South Africa, we started, when we were first asked to wear masks, and even I think till now, it said that we could use a cloth mask, mask that we could make ourselves. Because firstly, that was competing with medical masks and the lack of supply. So I'm not sure if that went through. I take it that we all different and different levels of impoverishment. But I'm also keen to see that, I don't know, like to what extent in Malawi, like when there's an election, or I don't know, when there's like in a traditional affair or something, to what extent are there local channels of communication? And, going to school is one thing, but there is a network that still manages and moves around, and to what extent these networks are being utilized, as well as social media in some ways, just to ask some of those questions. And then lastly, and this is more a comment, I think some notions of, it needs some things that need to be publicly procured, like masks, unless you're in a hospital situation, etc. I don't think it's actually useful or relevant for national government or local government to pursue it, simply because of the propensity to for prices to be increased and for corruption to occur. So, I'm just thinking out aloud, and maybe other colleagues have other viewpoints on that, and I accept that. But yeah, I'm just asking those questions. We had the same problem in South Africa, where, well, in eThekwini, where we procured some infrastructure for the homeless, and I don't know what we were actually paying. Probably much more expensive than anyone else would have got it themselves if they had money, or if they went to the store, or maybe they would even use their own resources. So even though we see resources, sometimes it's as meager as that, and sometimes there's other resources that people also bring to bear. Thanks.
Thanks, Subs. Professor Manda, if you would like to give a quick response.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
The self-made masks were also very common here in Malawi. But I noticed a change when the government announced that they were sending funds to all district councils and city councils to buy one mask for each resident. And then people were waiting, and then the next was that the money has flown to heaven. And the next comment, the next comment, you asked about the use of media, if it is used to call or to communicate. The way politics is done in Malawi cannot work using social networks or even the media. The media is only used to announce where the political rally will be, and everybody will be packed up there so that you can see face to face with your political leader. And that is one way through which COVID has spread. And I think it's the one which led to the untimely death of 2 cabinet ministers because of such political rallies. I agree with you. That's why I highlighted the issue of procurement of these masks. I really agree with you that it can lead to corruption. And this is the real reason why the funds at first 6 billion Malay Kwacha and later 17 billion cannot be accounted for, because the money was just being distributed out. Yes, for COVID, but it was not used for COVID. Just people just benefited it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Manda. I'll now hand you over to Injimiso Zandu, who will introduce our next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Nila.
To move on, good. Good.
Okay, hopefully there's no echo now. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Serene. Hopefully I pronounced it well. She is an urban planner specializing in strategic planning, mega projects governance, teaching at the Ion Munsi University of Architect and Urban Planning, barista at Bucharesta at the Urban and Landscaping Design Department for 6 years. She was educated at the Technical University of Berlin, Urban Habitat Unit, and received a PhD from Munsi University with supervision from Istanbul Technical University for research on governance and planning processes in mega projects. With the experience of almost 7 years, she practices urban planning and took part in projects of infrastructure, housing, retail, execution of detailed plans, zonal development plans, master plans, and also strategic general developments in the private and public, but also consultancy projects in Berlin, Istanbul, and Bucharest. Serene, she's also an ISOCAP member since the 51st World Planning Congress, was track co-chair at the 56th Congress, post-early planning for urban green deals. Professor, over to you and welcome once again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
we can hear you.
Because it has a bit of delay at my part, but I hope it will work out. I'm delighted to be there with you and debate furthermore on what the other speakers said earlier.
Professor Serene?
Yes.
Can you speak a bit louder, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's better now, right? You can see my presentation.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Firstly, I just want to mention that usually I'm giving presentation or doing research on mega projects and really other kind of complex projects. So for me, also being part of track 2 about urban health in ISOCARP, and also this last year was very refreshing to look a bit on the grassroots level or bottom-up initiatives, or more, you know, not small, as in not significant, but more quick informal interventions in the urban tissue that have a greater impact. So I'm going to propose a kind of resilient view towards this crisis and how we can learn from the COVID-19 crisis for a future urban planning logic. Yes, 2020 and maybe 5 years from now on are marked by this crisis, and not only an urban health crisis, but an unfolding economic and climate and so on crisis simultaneously. It was something long foreseen. If we remember our, urban agenda, SDGs, and so on. And unfortunately, it caught us unprepared. But we have to look of how we should handle it further on, and look a bit back. What was the plan before? So we had, especially looking at the SDGs, we had some very cohesive, comprehensive, well-established policy goals until 2030, especially considering the goal 11, and considering that COVID-19 implications were mostly in the urban environment. It is harder to be achieved, of course, but when we look at the UN data, we were far behind reaching the goals, even with this pandemic crisis. And I think the question is still in cities, despite the recent discourses on maybe going back to rural areas or this kind of trends, at least in Europe, where I'm from. But I think we have to look a bit in the same time on this integrative solutions of taking all the lessons that we have drawn until now. Maybe not rethink the planning logic altogether, like some people would say, like rewrite the SDGs, rewrite everything, but just integrate them and maybe shape them more flexibly. But the point that I want to make is it was always too late for some of us. And I'm thinking of the, urban poor and the vulnerable parts of the globe. And with or without the COVID crisis, this is not an unprecedented regarding the big urban issues like poverty and climate change and so on. And it will always be too late. In my opinion, now looking at the 2020 and the lessons from there, if we don't design short-term responses and don't engage in accelerated actions. So again, looking at the COVID-19 crisis, what would be the opportunities that we can extract from this? And we saw some short-term responses like social distancing, and we saw also some reactions of planners or architects that were a bit nostalgic of that utopian city image, and were trying to rethink urban density or 1.5 meter city, etc. But also we saw, like other speakers mentioned previously, really concrete hands-on examples at grassroots level, positive examples like tactical urbanism, 15-minute city, etc. So I am particularly interested in looking at bottom-up responses with, I'm going to show just some small cases from Southeast Europe, Romania, because I believe in empowering the future through immediate actions. And looking, of course, there were a lot of downsides, but looking at the many responses to COVID-19 in a lot of countries, actually, they have proven a lot of collaborative working and flexibility and social innovative change. And I think we should learn from this as planners, especially. So in the category of informal welfare system, and how important is this to take as lesson further on in our policy planning from a bottom-up initiative. This is a case of grassroots initiative and using social media, and how actually a post on Facebook became a national movement based on donations and crowdfunding and volunteer work. The project distributed, of course, free face shields to hospitals, but the lesson here is to take this, public participation and engagement of citizens, actually. It had also this part of 3D solution and creations, of course, but this is not the main lesson here. However, we have to engage also with the technological dimension in our cities. Another example here is another bottom-up initiative that was supported by the state. It's called For Romania. It is actually an app to give solutions and consultations during the pandemic. And a lesson here to be taken upon our future design policy is exactly this line of embracing technology and cross-sectoral collaboration. Further on here, we talked a lot about urban commons. If you look at the new urbanism trends, there were always brought in front the commons and the public space and inclusive spaces for everybody, but somehow we never grasped how important this is on this kind of life and death matter. And I think here, for example, it's a very interesting public space that it was left for the community, and in that space, a hospital could create further on departments, kind of modular hospital in its courtyard. So instead of engaging in this real estate, thriving for development of every square meter, if you leave this kind of open spaces, they can be resources in this kind of extreme situations. So a future design policy, for example, at city level would be strategic open reserves. And these were all examples at national and capital city level. But this is an example of another city in Romania, which is a medium-sized city. And it was again an initiative supported by the municipality. And it had a database, and you see also the digital aspects. It's within a site, a website. And it had documents responses to the COVID-19 crisis to identify the changes needed for the medium term care of community needs. So an open source planning of grasping different views from the communities within this period of time. And this is another example from the same city, which is a reconversion of an existing building. And this is also in line with all those examples on temporary uses and why are they important and so on. And you can see here the municipality of Cluj that temporarily changed the function of a hall, of a big events hall, and make it a hospital. And this is maybe one of the most popular examples that we've seen across the world of these big buildings reconverted to what we actually needed for a time period. And a future design policy would be, flexible type of buildings for multi-purpose use. And now those were the previous ones were all examples of 2020, but here I selected a last one that is happening right now, actually, in the capital city in Romania. It's called Open Streets Project, and it's initiated by 2 NGOs, and the municipality of Bucharest also took this project and moved it further to a much more network system level in the city. And you can see here in the map, there are the streets that are open to the public for in the weekends, actually, as a lesson learned from this 2020 period. And you can see here in the image how they look, and they are in the middle of the week they are with cars, and in the weekends they're freely open to pedestrians. And we hope to make it maybe for the long-term planning of our city. So coming back to a more theoretical view and the conceptual framework, maybe the responses are not necessarily social isolation and reshaping again what urban is and how urban planning is done, but just grasping the short-term planning initiatives and examples, the ones that worked, and incorporating them in our long-term planning strategies. And learning from the COVID-19 crisis, maybe we should have more public budget expenditures, we should engage more with the NGOs and the community-based initiatives, grasp this grassroots level actions and move it further at the city level, or just empower them more and make them part of our long-term planning of our cities towards a more resilient city concept. And now I would want to make a parallel, because we talked about SDGs, and I want to make a parallel between the sustainability concept and the resilience concept. And what I really want to say about this lessons taken from this crisis. The sustainability concept, it's somehow based on the survival by desirable system stability, equitable provision of basic needs. However, resilience concept, it's much more known on the definition of survival by the system dynamic capacity to provide basic needs in an unstable environment. So it has the ability, when you look from a resilient perspective, or when a system has this resilience attribute to it, it has the ability to develop new responses. It has the ability to be resourceful, to work on a network base, and to be knowledge based on its solutions. And I think maybe this is something that we were missing in the SDGs, because we have a desirable image of after I don't know how many years, but maybe we really need also this flexible and process-based readjustments in this long-term planning. And on a conceptual evaluation of resilience, we have contributions like dynamic approach, complexity, short-term processes. Whereas in the sustainability concept, we have bottlenecks as lack of dynamics, limitations of that overarching balance between social, economic, and ecological systems that we always talk about in books and conferences, but we never manage to actually pinpoint on the actions that, on the projects. How does a sustainable project look like? Is it big? Is it small? It has a mix of different type of fluxes of streets. It has different type of functions. It includes, different social groups, etc. So we have a policy, but we don't have this actual specialization of it, maybe. And also a bottleneck regarding the long-term planning process. And we will be considering all the crises that we are facing in our urban environment. I think we will be disturbed in the future, unfortunately, by many other crises like this. So as conclusions, learning from COVID-19 crisis for a future planning project, crises are moments that enforce pre-existing problems. We knew about these problems before. Integrated solutions to tackle simultaneously are welcomed, and that means tackling climate, health, economic crisis, and all in the same time. Future strategies have to focus on the concept of resilience, and sustainability concept, I said, should be upgraded with this resilience viewpoint. There is a need for both top-down and bottom-up approaches. as you saw in the examples, the short examples that I showed, it's always a grassroots initiative that is empowered through different levels of the state, whether it is municipality or even it goes to the national level. You really need this both way planning and collaboration. We should embrace and make use of our technological dimension in our cities would be my last conclusion, because after all, we are now on Zoom and we are taking advantage of being able to share knowledge and debate through this means. Thank you. That was from my side. If there are any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Seren. That's certainly interesting, and it brings the realism back into what we are doing and what we are in terms of planning and what's been done and how we take it forward. You speak about sustainability and resilience of long-term planning, of tactical urbanism. So there's quite a few concepts that you've brought in. It's like planning for disaster management, incorporating that into our everyday planning. And certainly this is not the end of COVID or future pandemics, as Nathan Ayer has alluded to. So thank you for your presentation. It's been interesting once again. We open the room up now to questions, comments. You're most welcome to pose it or verbally, or to write it into the chat box, and Professor Seren can address it. Thank you. Professor Chipungu, Dr. Chipungu has written a comment about, he says, it's quite fascinating intervention measures for urban environments. To what extent are some of these measures applicable in third world cities? Or how can we adapt some of these concepts given the challenges prevailing in third world cities? Professor Seren, if you could respond to that.
Yes, of course, these were all examples from an European dimension, but still from southern part of Europe, from a quite underdeveloping country. I think this part of engaging with the technological dimension, for example. Sorry.
Professor Seren, we cannot hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. I was saying that I would just take the last point that I made regarding the technological dimension. For example, I think it can bring a lot to the third world countries, actually, in terms of, you know, empowering this part of informal economy, or maybe, I know, a connection to the internet, it's not enough, but it has also the power to give information to the people that cannot access it. Regarding the urban commons, again, I think third world countries are in a very positive, no, I would say, in a very particular position to be able to not make the mistakes that we have done. And engage, for example, I know some projects by UN Habitat on mobility and how they are promoting this kind of, you know, cycling or other means of mobility in order to not make it to not make the urban environment very congested. What other lessons I would also take from the examples? I think any means that I said about crowdfunding and also grasping the bottom-up initiatives. It's very useful for the third world countries. And I don't know what other speakers would think about this. I would be very interested to know.
No, thank you. Certainly, I think participatory planning, which you speak about, the bottom-up approach, would be very useful, and you demonstrated that earlier. I'd just like to know whether, you said rethink urban density, social distancing, and that sort of thing. But in terms of densities of city itself, do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes. When I mentioned rethinking urban density, it's because we have seen a lot of, urban planners militating for this. And in my opinion, I think I would not go and rethink urban density as making the cities sprawl, or rethink, because there were a lot of discussions whether we have to, whether COVID spreads more in compact cities, in like big, densities, or it's or in the countryside where we have just a lot of space. And my point was that we don't have to rethink urban density. We can rethink some dynamics, but based on the livability concept, I think, and how to better mix different functions like housing, like open green spaces, public spaces, commercial spaces, etc.
Thank you, Professor Serin. Certainly, in the face of other challenges such as food security and efficiencies in the city, it makes sense to work with existing densities that obviously work in a bigger city, and to work around it for crisis management. So thank you very much. I think if we don't have any more questions or comments, we'll round off the session. And so I'd like to say thank you to everyone. You've raised some interesting points on urbanization and migration, on improving and enhancing the public realm in the city, about using technology in the workplace, promoting possibly an outdoor workplace, changing the streetscape to be more people-friendly. So we've learned a lot from this crisis that we find ourselves in, this pandemic, that will feed future development plans and new thoughts. So it's certainly been an interesting 2 hours of sharing of information and experiences in the third world, and we see a European city. It's been certainly eye-opening and poses a challenge to us as to how we go forward. So I'd like to say thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the SA Cities Network and the various stakeholders for making the session possible, for bringing us all together. And a big thank you to all our presenters. You have provided us with your time and invaluable contribution. We thank you for that. And if we can, let's all turn our videos on and give our presenters a good round of applause in thanking them. So great, thank you. To the audience, we hope that you have enjoyed being with us and that you will take some of these learnings back into your environment, back into your workspace, and change the way we do things. So we thank you for joining us and being here and giving us your time. So in conclusion, please take care, everyone. Stay safe. We will meet again in the morning for the report back on the plenary discussions and the closing remarks on the symposium. So thank you, and go